días a todos. Es un privilegio para nosotros estar aquí en la organización de este evento del Tercer Congreso Internacional de Ríos y Humedales. Antes de empezar, quisiera verificar solamente un par de elementos. Dr. Ellen Wohl, good morning. I just want to verify for sure that you are there right now at this point.
I am here.
Perfect. That's really great. Okay. Buenos días, Dr. Ellen. I will speak in Spanish and in English to do the combination of and the presentation, and then by the moment that corresponds, I will let you dominate the auditorium. Perfect. Buenos días. Como mencionaba anteriormente, es un honor estar aquí. Este corredor ribereño y del río Colorado. En su presentación, la doctora Ellen va pues a presentarnos un componente importante de lo Colorado State University, su investigación enfocada en geomorfología fluvial. Tiene énfasis específico en cañones de lecho rocoso y ríos montañosos. Su investigación estudia los efectos de palizadas y la construcción de dams por castores en los sistemas de diferentes ríos y obviamente la productividad y complejidad de ecosistemas ribereños, así como el almacenamiento de carbono en los sistemas fluviales del Parque Nacional Rocky Mountain en Colorado, en los Estados Unidos. Dr. Wohl ha recibido significativo número de honores, entre ellos ha sido ha recibido el Gladys W. Cole Memorial Award, asignado por la Geological Society of America, the Kirk Bryan Award, también otorgado por la Geological Society of America, the J.K. Gilbert Award por la Asociación de Geógrafos de Estados Unidos, Association of American Geographers, y finalmente por parte de Colorado State University el reconocimiento por Outstanding Contributions to Interdisciplinary Water Education Research and Outreach por el Colorado State University Water Center. Mentioning then, we are really pleased to have Dr. Ellen Wohl today. In her presentation, she will emphasize elements associated to her research currently advanced. Dr. Ellen Wohl is a University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Geosciences at Colorado State University. Her research focuses on fluvial geomorphology with specific emphasis on bedrock canyons and mountain rivers. Her current research project studies evaluate the effects of log jams and beaver dams on channel complexity, productivity of river ecosystems, and carbon storage in Rocky Mountain National Park. Dr. Wohl has been the recipient of several awards, including the Gladys W. Cole Memorial Award from the Geological Society of America, the Kirk Bryan Award from the Geological Society of America as well, the J.K. Gilbert Award from the American Association of Geographers, and the award for outstanding contributions to interdisciplinary water education research and outreach from the Colorado State University Water Center. So, not saying more, we are really pleased to have Dr. Ellen Wohl, a very well-recognized professional, her talk for presentation or discussion today, the connectivity in the river corridor and river network. So, Dr. Wohl, at this point, we only have all our entire attention on you. We are really happy, pleased, and thankful for your presence. So, please, you have, I think, all the credits and all the rights to project and everything that is needed. I'm just here to help and to guide you in anything that will be needed from you. And I'm going to speak in Spanish for a moment for everybody. Al auditorio, entonces vamos a seguir la presentación de la doctora Wohl y al final entonces vamos a avanzar con sesiones de preguntas y respuestas. Todo el mundo está invitado a extender las preguntas a lo largo del chat y pues al final yo las transmitiré para su correspondiente respuesta. Perfecto, entonces estamos todos listos. Dr. Wohl, we are all yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen right now?
I can see your screen, yes, ma'am.
Okay, then I will go to the full slideshow. And thank you very much for that introduction. That was a lot to say in 2 different languages, so I appreciate it. Thank you, all of you, for allowing me to speak in English.
It's an honor for us, actually. Thank you so much for that.
Well, I'll start with a picture of a channel some of you may recognize. This is outside of Bogota. I had the opportunity to visit what seems like long ago, pre-COVID, and it was a very fun visit. But yes, I'm going to talk about connectivity in river corridors and river networks today. So I'll give a little bit of background on some of these terms and talk about sort of how I conceptualize rivers and natural regimes that influence rivers, then talk specifically about different aspects of connectivity, and finally put connectivity in the context of river management. So by way of background, I use the phrase a river corridor rather than just saying river, because I think for most of us, if you just hear river, you think only of the active channel. And of course, the active channel is very strongly connected in natural rivers to the adjacent floodplain and to the underlying hypereic zone. And if you're not familiar with the term hypereic zone, it's subsurface water where the flow paths originate in the surface stream, flow through the subsurface for some distance, and then return to the surface stream. So it's distinct from groundwater. And this diagram from a paper in 2015, I think, makes the point very nicely that, of course, things do move downstream, water, solids, sediment, but that's not a simple linear uniform progression. There's very strongly 3-dimensional connectivity in river networks between the channel, the floodplain, and the hypereic zone. So using that phrase river corridor helps to emphasize that connectivity. Another way to think of this, you can think of it as almost a ternary diagram between those 3 primary components of channel, floodplain, and hypereic. There are surface and subsurface connections between the channel and the floodplain that are mediated by things like overbank flow and bank erosion. There are, again, surface and subsurface connectivity between the hypereic zone and the floodplain through upwelling and downwelling. And sorry about that. And there are surface and subsurface connectivity between the channel and hypereic, again, upwelling and downwelling. So primarily water and solids, but there are organisms that live in the hypereic as well, both microbial communities and some macroinvertebrates. So again, if we conceptualize rivers as river corridors, it really emphasizes some of these interactions between physical process and form, biogeochemical processes such as denitrification, and the biotic communities that live in the river corridor, whether it's microbes in the hypereic zone or forests on the floodplain. I think it also really emphasizes those interactions between the 3 physical components of channel, floodplain, and hypereic zone. And when I think of a river corridor at the reach scale, where a reach is a length of valley that has consistent morphology. So if you're on a very small headwater channel, that might be 10 meters or 20 meters in length. If you're on the Amazon, that might be many tens of kilometers in length. But within that reach scale, you have fluxes that come into and through the river corridor. And in all rivers, that's water and sediment. And then in forested river corridors, large wood is also a very important input and flux. And those fluxes interact with what I've called the context here. So it's essentially the valley geometry. Where are you in the river network, say up in the headwaters or down in a lowland portion? What are the lateral limits for channel and floodplain adjustments? The 2 inset photos here on the left, there's a very narrow bedrock canyon. On the right, there's an example of a broad floodplain river. And whatever forms the boundaries of the floodplain, how erosionally resistant are those boundaries? Are they bedrock, as in that photo on the left, or alluvium? How stable is the base level? So all of these create the context for how those fluxes interact with morphology. And I put human influence in here because we typically don't change valley geometry, but we do change how rivers interact with that valley geometry by, say, regulating flow or by channelizing rivers, artificially stabilizing the banks, or building artificial levees as examples. So the fluxes interact with the context, and that results in a series of characteristics. I've listed some very primary ones here: spatial heterogeneity, or the patchiness of the river corridor, connectivity, which of course is the emphasis today, resilience, and geomorphic and ecological integrity. And all of these 4 or 5 primary characteristics are very strongly interrelated to one another. So we can start with spatial heterogeneity. What exactly am I talking about? I'm referring to anything that makes a river corridor different from an irrigation canal or an urban river. I tend to use those as examples because, when we design an irrigation canal, we make it as homogeneous and uniform as possible. It's straight, it's got a consistent cross-sectional geometry and a consistent gradient because we don't want erosion or deposition. So in natural channels, anything that causes the river corridor to deviate from that. So it could be differences in the stream bed in terms of the presence of bed forms like pools and riffles, or differences in the grain size distribution. In the photo you're looking at here, there's a channel spanning logjam that's creating a backwater, and that's creating spatial heterogeneity in the bed relative to up and downstream portions of the channel. Could be heterogeneity in the banks. This is a very small scale example. You can see these little embayments and protrusions. That's making this channel different than something that just has straight banks with a uniform cross section. And those irregularities on the stream banks can be associated with vegetation or bends, expansions or constrictions, something more resistant like a large boulder, for example. There's also heterogeneity of the cross-sectional form associated with bed forms like pools and riffles, or with meander bends. And then finally with the plan form. The inset photo in upper right is an example of a meandering channel with a whole series of cut-off abandoned meanders that are gradually filling in. So the sinuosity of the channel plan form, the number of channels, if it's a braided or anastomosing channel, those are all forms of spatial heterogeneity. And I'm mentioning spatial heterogeneity in this context because it really has a strong influence on connectivity. If you look at the photo of the logjam on the lower left, that logjam, of course, is an obstruction. So it's limiting longitudinal connectivity, but because it's an obstruction, it's creating a pressure gradient that facilitates hyperetic exchange. So it's increasing vertical connectivity, and it's also facilitating overbank flow. So it's increasing lateral connectivity. So it's not that heterogeneity uniformly increases or decreases connectivity. It has different effects on different forms of connectivity, if you think of connectivity as being three-dimensional, but there is a strong relationship. What creates spatial heterogeneity? Well, the geologic controls that I'm referring to here would be things like sediment inputs, differences in the context, that reach scale, valley floor width, and erodibility of the boundaries. Certainly vegetation can create a lot of spatial heterogeneity from the scale of the root wad of a single tree growing along the bank, to downwood in the channel that creates log jams, to, say, marsh vegetation that facilitates formation of an anastomosing channel. And finally, over on the right here, those fluxes that are coming in at the reach scale of water, sediment, and large wood. Those all fundamentally drive sediment erosion and deposition through time and space, and that's what really creates the heterogeneity through processes like lateral channel movement, or changes in the bed forms or substrate distribution, and the other properties that I was just talking about, like cross-sectional geometry and plan form. The second thing other than connectivity on that diagram that I had in terms of a characteristic that responds to how fluxes interact with the reach scale context is resilience. And I'm defining that as the ability of a system, in this case the river corridor, to absorb disturbances. So they could be natural, like a flood or a drought, or human caused, like a chemical spill, for example, or flow regulation that alters flood peaks. But if the system is resilient, it can absorb those disturbances without diminishing or changing floodplain or river corridor functions. And as an example, this is a system in Rocky Mountain National Park, which was mentioned in the introduction. It's just to the west of where I live, so I do a lot of work there because it's a very natural environment. And you're looking at what's called a beaver meadow. So it's a portion of the valley floor that has been highly modified by beaver, which are naturally only present in the northern hemisphere. But they build dams and dig canals, and you have this scenario where you have a lot of surface water stored in ponds, and also a multi-thread channel or anastomosing channel that goes through this very dense riparian vegetation that's referred to as a willow car. So this system is quite resilient to disturbances. If you have a drought or a wildfire, there's a lot of surface water and a very high water table. If you have a flood, the flood flows spread into these multiple branching channels, and when they go over bank, they encounter this extremely dense riparian vegetation. So in this case, there's very strong lateral and vertical connectivity within this river corridor, and that equates to resilience to a variety of disturbances. The last two phrases that I had on that earlier slide were geomorphic and ecological integrity. And geomorphic or physical integrity was defined by Will 20 years ago now. Basically is the ability of the river corridor to adjust to changing fluxes. So if a river has physical integrity and you double the sediment input, say there's a landslide, then the characteristics like the grain size distribution in the bed or the width to depth ratio or the channel planform can change in response to that. If a river lacks physical integrity, say it's a concrete lined canal in a city, it doesn't adjust to those inputs. And ecological integrity is a phrase you're probably more familiar with. It's been around for a lot longer, but ecologists usually define it as the ability of an ecosystem to support and maintain a natural community of organisms. And both geomorphic or physical integrity and ecological integrity, again, are very strongly influenced by connectivity and usually depend on natural levels of connectivity. And I say natural levels rather than high levels because some systems, of course, have very low levels of connectivity. They are naturally disconnected, and often the river corridor morphology and the native biota that are present there are adjusted to that level of disconnectivity. An example would be a dry region where you have an ephemeral or an intermittent channel. There are some nice studies in Australia, for example, that have shown that when you have urbanization and you have more consistent runoff entering a dry stream network, it can become a perennial stream, and that favors a different suite of organisms. You can have fish, for example, coming into the river that were never present there when it was ephemeral channel. So the idea is that integrity really depends on natural levels of connectivity, whether those are naturally high or naturally low. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of backgrounds are natural regimes. And the first one of these that was really described in the scientific literature was the natural flow regime in a very highly cited paper by Leroy Poff and others back in 1997. They were mostly ecologists who wrote this paper, and they basically said that the integrity of the river corridor depends on having a variety of flows through time. You need both base flows and peak flows that alternate on a regular cycle. And they viewed stream flow as the master variable that really influences, as it says here, the abundance, the distribution, the diversity of riverine species. And riverine here would be both aquatic and riparian. And they picked out 5 key characteristics of stream flow that can be specified using gauge records or systematic discharge records. At the time they wrote that paper, they acknowledged that sediment was really important, but they said, well, we're not going to address it because we have so few sediment gauge records. And I would assume it's similar in Colombia to the United States. We have many, many stream gauges, but very few of those actually measure suspended sediment, and none of them measure bedload. So we don't know nearly as much about the natural sediment regime. But a few years ago, a group of us got together, this was physical scientists and ecologists, and said, well, it's hard to quantify, but that doesn't mean it's not important. So basically, we made the point that water and sediment that come into and move through the river corridor are fundamental drivers of the physical condition. And because of that, if you're really going to manage river corridors, you need to know something about how water and sediment interact. So we talked about sediment in terms of a budget, where you have inputs, transport, or output, and storage. And we, in this paper, talked about how the interactions of water and sediment lead to these response variables, like the geometry of the channel or the river corridor, the stability, the characteristics of habitat for aquatic and riparian species, nutrient dynamics, and the disturbance regime. And then just a couple of years after that, I thought, well, in a lot of rivers that have forests, either in the riparian corridor or in the uplands where you can have large wood transported into the river, large wood is an equally important driver. This is the one that I think most of us forget because we have a long history of deforestation as humans, and also a very long history that goes back centuries in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, of actively removing wood from channels in order to enhance navigation or to limit overbank flooding. So in the natural wood regime, we talked about things like wood process domains. This is just a schematic illustration here that you have different forms of input, transport, and storage in different portions of a river network, and emphasized the importance of understanding that spatial context if you're going to look at the role, physical and ecological roles of large wood and manage large wood. So this is kind of a summary of now what I think of as the tripod of physical processes that support river ecosystems. There are lots of other variables that are very important for a river as an ecosystem, such as water quality, food supply, water chemistry. But for physical processes, I think it's really flow, sediment, and wood regime that influence the response variables that you're seeing on the four corners here, including connectivity. So I tend to think of the river corridor as an ecosystem. I'm a physical scientist. My background is geology, but much of our management is focused on one of two things. It's either trying to reduce hazards to humans and their infrastructure, or it's trying to support ecosystem services, whether that's drinking water supplies, fisheries, flood attenuation, etc. So I think I find it more appropriate to think of the river corridor as an ecosystem, because if you weren't worried about the biota in the river corridor, what does it matter really if the channel morphology changes dramatically or if the flow regime changes dramatically? But it does matter if you're trying to sustain native organisms. So in that context of thinking of a river corridor as an ecosystem, you have these multiple drivers, always water and sediment, and in some catchments, large wood. That river corridor integrates inputs from at least everything upstream of it, and given atmospheric transport of some important things like fine sediment and some nutrients that can integrate inputs from a different hemisphere in some cases. It does have these interactions among physical, chemical, and biotic components, and it provides a variety of ecosystem services that we humans tend to value. But the key to all of this, to a functioning river corridor and ecosystem, is that you maintain those natural levels of three-dimensional hydrologic connectivity, whether it's disconnected or connected. So moving to connectivity, you can think of it within the river network, the entire watershed or drainage basin. And then you've got really these landscape scale controls or regional controls like climate and geology interacting to govern water and sediment and solutes that come in. You also need to think about upstream, downstream interactions. How do the headwaters influence what's going on much lower in the catchment? And in this context, I think going back to that idea of fluxes occurring in a context of a reach, the fluxes of the material that come into and within a reach, and then the transmission downstream within the river network, have strong influences, strong cumulative effects downstream. So if we want to go back to the idea of resilience and the ability to respond or absorb disturbance, if you're looking at resilience at the network scale, then what happens in all of the channel segments within that river network really matter, particularly in the smaller channels. I think a lot of times management ignores first and second order channels because they're small, they're hard to find. How can they be that important? But all the yellow blobs are highlighting, well, I see I missed one, but they're highlighting most of the first order channels here. And there are some nice summary papers that indicate that no matter where you are in the world, 70 to 80% of the total river length is in those small channels. So the cumulative effects of whatever happens in those can be very important for the downstream parts of a river network that realistically tend to get more concerned in terms of things like fisheries or navigation or water quality. Okay, so now that I've used the term a lot, I know you all know what connectivity is. That's what this whole meeting is about. But my definition here is that it's transfer of matter or energy, and that includes organisms, between landscape compartments. So they can be adjacent landscape compartments, like sediment from an adjacent hill slope coming into a river, or they can be geographically disconnected. So the example here of windblown dust that comes, I'm not sure what happens in Colombia, but I'm thinking of the Caribbean, for example, where windblown dust from North Africa is a very important source of nutrients to some of the coral reefs. So I'm sure Colombia gets windblown dust from somewhere outside of Colombia. In my part of the world, we get dust from China. So for better or worse, we really are globally interconnected. One thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that connectivity is a continuum. It's not an either or, but disconnectivity is also very important. So any process or structure that limits physical contact or transfer, the photo I've got here is from New Zealand, but if you look at the lower part of these hill slopes, of course, the gradient decreases and there's kind of a convexity that's an alluvial fan. So that alluvial fan is creating a limited amount of disconnectivity for sediment and water transfer from the hill slopes to the channel, and that can be very important. It attenuates sediment fluxes, for example. A lot of times you have a lot of groundwater recharge on alluvial fans and then a line of springs and seeps at the base of the fan. So I think that the point is that it's important to remember that disconnectivity can also be very beneficial in some settings. And of course, you can talk about connectivity in a variety of contexts. So biological would be how organisms or propagules move. Riverine would be just focusing on usually just the channel, sometimes just the river corridor. Hydrologic, you're just focusing on water, or you can focus on sediment, etc. But for any of these types of connectivity, you can specify different characteristics like the magnitude, how much material or how many organisms are able to move about, how long does that connectivity last, how frequently is it present, how far does it extend. There are a lot of descriptors that are relevant. I think one thing that's important to conceptualize, though, is that there are consistent downstream changes in connectivity going from the headwaters to a lowland plain. If you think of an idealized river, say, starting in the mountains, in the headwaters or the source zone, typically the adjacent uplands and the channels are really closely coupled. There's not much floodplain development. The tributaries are closely coupled to the main stem because, again, there's not a lot of floodplain development, so you don't have so much attenuation of downstream fluxes. Longitudinal transfer of sediment is very efficient. I'm not going to go through all the bullet points, but if you go to the bottom here, by the time you're into the lowland plains, you often have a very broad and thick floodplain. So there's more lateral connectivity and less longitudinal connectivity. And again, there's probably more vertical connectivity associated with that. So you can describe some general patterns here that just popped up on the left. Things like increasing sediment storage and residence time as you go downstream, decreasing connectivity between the slope and the channels, etc. So they're qualitative. And they can be quantified, and there can also be interruptions to this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a scenario where you start downstream and the river corridor is getting wider, the floodplain is more longitudinally continuous, and then all of a sudden you go into a bedrock gorge again and there is no floodplain, but then farther downstream you go back to that progression of a gradually larger floodplain. So the downstream continuum in connectivity can be interrupted by big changes in the geometry of the river corridor, but these are general patterns that I'm illustrating here. And this comes from Gary Brierley and Kirsty Fryer's book on geomorphology and river management. And they were writing about systems specifically in Australia, but the patterns that they describe, I think, apply to most places in the world. So how do we measure connectivity? Well, there's the direct measurements. You have ground sensors or some type of instrumentation on the ground. Those, of course, are expensive, labor intensive. They're often limited in duration. They may have started a few decades ago at most. Increasingly now, we're using something that's remote, whether it's something like an unmanned aerial vehicle or a drone, or satellite-based remote sensing that can cover very large spatial areas and long time spans at increasingly high spatial resolution. You can look at past records of connectivity using things like stratigraphic characteristics or sediment records and developing some age control or geochronology for those sediments. You can use numerical models to infer connectivity based on the characteristics of the system and perhaps a limited amount of empirical data. But fundamentally, I think the assessment of connectivity or disconnectivity is very strongly dependent on spatial and temporal scales. And this gets back to this idea of connectivity occurring along a continuum rather than just being a binary. Yeah, it's connected, or no, it's disconnected. It's never that simple. Especially when you think of a river corridor, if it has multiple components, Certain materials might have high longitudinal connectivity, whereas others have much lower. So water, for example, if there are no major obstructions in the channel, probably has high longitudinal connectivity. If you are looking at a system that is fairly steep and coarse-grained substrate, it's going to have limited longitudinal connectivity just because the sediment isn't moving all the time. There's some entrainment threshold that has to be exceeded before you even start to move sediment downstream, and then it typically moves a relatively short distance before it's deposited again. But on the other hand, suspended sediment could have much higher longitudinal connectivity. So I think the point is that if you have a system with multiple components, the magnitude of connectivity varies between individual materials and between different compartments, such as the floodplain and channel or hyporheic zone. So having said all that, what promotes connectivity? Well, longitudinal is having a very open channel that is fairly homogeneous. So you know in-channel obstructions, limited heterogeneity where you can create flow separation and lateral marginal storage, and of course perennial flow as opposed to ephemeral or intermittent. That keeps everything moving downstream. Lateral, just the opposite. If you want to promote connectivity between the channel and the floodplain, then it's really helpful to have in-channel obstructions that are more likely to facilitate flow over the channel banks. And it's helpful to have a fairly wide, shallow channel and multiple channels, secondary channels that branch and rejoin. Having a lateral channel that moves from side to side, whether it's meandering or braided, for example, that increases that connectivity. And certainly overbank flows, whether it's just because there's a huge amount of discharge coming into, or a huge amount of water coming into the river corridor, or because there's an increase in water and then there's a lot of obstructions in the channel. And similarly with vertical connectivity between the surface and subsurface, the more heterogeneous the channel and the more obstructions you have that create pressure gradients, the more of that exchange you're going to have. And overbank flows promote infiltration and hyporheic exchange on the floodplain. Okay, so why does all this matter? Well, one very basic consideration is how fast everything moves downstream, conveyance versus attenuation. So if you have high longitudinal connectivity, you have good conveyance, the flood goes fast and then proceeds to base flow. If you have, say, limited longitudinal connectivity for whatever reason, then you attenuate fluxes. And the two photos here, the upper one is from a site in Northern Australia. You can see, if you can see my cursor, I think even if you can't see the cursor, you can see the low flow, the main channel. And then there's this very extensive floodplain on the coastal plain that is inundated during the monsoon season. And of course, that water is moving downstream very slowly, as are the solutes and the suspended sediment moving with it. The photo in the lower right is sort of the opposite end of the spatial scale. That's a channel that's about 2 meters wide. It's a headwater channel in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's mostly a very steep channel with boulder substrate and steps and pools, but there's a very small log jam here. It's almost a twig jam rather than a log jam. It's creating an obstruction to downstream flow. So it's attenuating the fluxes of the fine sediment that is normally carried in suspension, the sand-sized material you see here, and the organic matter. That would be a fairly transient obstruction. Probably the next peak flow after I took this photo, it was gone. But during base flow, it did attenuate those fluxes. So in these two examples, the big one in the upper left, if you're attenuating a major flood peak, of course, you're both sustaining the floodplain biota that depend on that flood pulse that was originally described for the Amazon. And you're attenuating flood peaks to downstream areas. In this particular example, the only downstream area is the ocean. But if there was an urban area downstream, you'd be attenuating the flood peak. In the example in the lower right, that organic material that's being stored in that little backwater pool is normally quite mobile in these steep, high gradient and laterally confined systems. So it's hard for aquatic insects or microbes to get access to that. If the organic matter is stored even for a matter of hours, let alone months, in a little backwater like this, that really increases the biological uptake of nutrients. So for a variety of reasons, conveyance versus attenuation matters. Connectivity also creates feedbacks and emergent behavior. And the example I have here is from a gravel bed stream. So something limited the transport of the very coarse, say, cobble to small boulder-sized sediment during the last peak flow. That started the formation of a gravel bar. The gravel bar, in turn, is an obstacle that increases vertical connectivity, and it may increase lateral connectivity. And the other phrase I've got here is based on work by Tom Batten and his group in Switzerland. And this photo that I'm showing at upper right is from one of his study streams in Switzerland. You have different microbial communities that live in the subsurface in a gravel bar than you do in the adjacent active channel. So if you create a gravel bar, that influences the gaseous emissions of organic carbon and the hypereic exchange. If there is large wood in the system, as you see in the photo at the left, upper left, gravel bars are very good at trapping wood. The wood then creates a whole series of secondary effects. As you trap more wood, you may completely span the channel and have a big log jam. That's an obstruction to flow that increases overbank flow. It can increase lateral migration and movement of the channel across the floodplain. It may lead to formation of a multi-thread channel like anastomosing. The logjam creates backwater that stores sediment and organic matter. It also tends to trap more wood, so you get a bigger logjam. The logjam is an obstacle that increases vertical connectivity and hypereic exchange. So you have all these secondary effects occurring. The logjam on the point bar is also a good place for plant propagules to be deposited and to germinate. So you may have vegetated islands that develop from those bars, and that further decreases longitudinal connectivity. And the idea is that the circles here are indicating these feedbacks. So the emergent behavior is you may start with a simple gravel bar, but you end up with all these secondary effects that can develop from that. So again, the connectivity or lack of connectivity strongly influences processes like hypereic exchange and the associated nutrient dynamics and gaseous emissions of carbon in the corridor. Connectivity can also strongly influence the ability of the river corridor to resist disturbance or recover from it. And what you're looking at here is a site in Idaho, which is in the northwestern United States, a dry region. It had a forest fire. I think this photo is from 2017. You can see the uplands were intensely burned. The river corridor remained green because it had been modified by beavers. So it's got all these ponds and surface water storage and a very high riparian water table. So in this example, the limited longitudinal connectivity created by those beaver dams and the enhanced lateral and vertical connectivity created a scenario where the river corridor is much more resilient to fire. It would also be more resilient to drought. So again, the details of connectivity influence resilience. The details of connectivity strongly influence nutrient dynamics and biogeochemistry. This is an example from a paper that was published on the Middle Fork Flathead River in Montana, again, the north central part of the western US. And the two drawings that you're looking at on the left are of this fairly spatially heterogeneous river corridor. It's a braided river, has a series of secondary channels. The floodplain is up to 2 kilometers wide in places. And the different colors are indicating different levels of carbon storage in floodplain soils and the potential for nitrate removal. And nitrate is a major pollutant in many rivers around the world. So if you have a very simple homogeneous river corridor that has high longitudinal connectivity, there's not much opportunity for denitrification or carbon storage. The more spatially heterogeneous that river corridor gets and the lower the longitudinal connectivity, but the higher the lateral and vertical connectivity, usually the greater the carbon storage potential because you have saturated soils with high primary productivity of vegetation on the floodplain, so you can store a lot of soil carbon, and you have this very patchy landscape in both the surface and the subsurface where you have different microbial communities that promote denitrification. Certainly, connectivity influences the abundance and the location of the habitats, their diversity, and that in turn can influence biomass and biodiversity. This is an example from the Yukon River in central Alaska. This is taken from a small plain. The Yukon is about 1 kilometer wide here. But if you just start looking at the characteristics of this floodplain, the fact that there's high lateral connectivity, both through channel migration and through overbank flow, you have things like secondary channels that are gradually infilling, bodies of open water, active secondary channels. So there is much more diverse habitat, and that can support a wider variety of biota, whether it's plants and animals or even microbial communities that then promote things like denitrification. And finally, of course, connectivity matters because it tends to support a lot of ecosystem services that we as people like, whether it's recreation, as on the two photos on the left, or clean drinking water, which is represented by the photo on the right. So coming back to that idea of connectivity and river management, a lot of what we as humans have done over the last few decades to centuries, I mean, some of this goes back 2 centuries, is to change connectivity in river corridors. We have changed it in 3 dimensions through various activities. Global flow regulation is the one that is best quantified. This example of a figure from nature, dams are hard to hide. Governments tend to be proud of them, and they show up well on remote sensing imagery. So there are a lot of quite accurate inventories globally of at least large dams. That gets much harder to quantify things like diversions, particularly if they're small and in headwater channels, or let alone the portions of a river network that have been channelized. Some of that channelization goes back more than a century, and there are no systematic records, or artificial levees are also harder to detect in remote imagery than dams. So if we just focus on dams, as it says here, less than a quarter of the rivers globally now flow uninterrupted to the ocean. And those tend to be at very high latitudes, like Siberia in Eurasia or the North American Arctic, or at very low latitudes, like the central part of Africa and the Amazon. So if you've got flow regulation, whether it's a dam or a diversion or both, then inherently the connectivity is altered. It could be increased or decreased. If it's a diversion, it might increase connectivity, but it is altered from natural conditions. So both at the river network scale for entire watersheds and also at the reach scale, a lot of river restoration now is focused on trying to restore more natural levels of connectivity. This is an example from a site in Italy in the Dolomites, and you can see the photo in 2005 here. Each of those white lines across the channel is a little check dam, and the channel banks are also stabilized. And then you can see that there's a variety of land uses in the historic floodplain, cities, recreational and agricultural fields. So the local water entities undertook a restoration project here to try and restore some of the longitudinal connectivity. So they took out the check dams. They restored a little bit of the lateral connectivity by removing some of the bank stabilization. They're not allowing the channel to reoccupy the entire historic floodplain because there are communities and other land uses there. So it's not an all or nothing process when you restore connectivity, or of course when you restore a river, but if you can restore some of the natural function connectivity, that can be very useful. And this picture is from 2010. I had the chance to visit the site in 2018, and now many of these bars are stabilized by native vegetation, so it's a mixture of bars and islands. It's still a braided river, which would be the natural channel morphology for this setting in the Alps. But there's a lot more diversity within the active channel migration zone, and there's more potential for at least local bank erosion that can create some of the diversity in riparian vegetation. And it's interesting, originally when this was proposed, the local communities were adamantly opposed. They really didn't want this project done. They didn't see braided rivers as desirable or natural. The project went ahead anyway, and it won an award from the European Union's Water Framework Directive. And now the local people are very proud of this stretch of the river. When I visited in 2018, it was kind of a miserable day. It was just about this time of year, and it was very cold. It was sort of sleeting, like rain mixed with snow, but there were a lot of people out in this river corridor. They were fishing, they were looking at birds, they were walking their dogs. People are using the river corridor and they're proud of it. So attitudes can change, and I think emphasizing river corridors as ecosystems can help with that. Another example from the northwestern US, this is from Oregon in the United States. The picture at the top is from 2016. You can ignore the dots, those are sample points. But prior to restoration, this was an incised single thread channel that was downstream from a dam that highly regulates peak flows. But there was geomorphic and stratigraphic evidence that this channel historically had been anastomosing, so multiple channels that branch and rejoin at a much higher level of connectivity to the floodplain. So the Forest Service went in, the U.S. Forest Service, they introduced thousands of large logs. They regraded the floodplain in the channel, and the photo that you see in the bottom is from 2019. It's now a multi-thread reach with very high lateral and vertical connectivity and limited longitudinal connectivity. And this was undertaken primarily in the context of trying to restore spawning habitat for salmon, the big charismatic megafauna, very large fish that were naturally present in this river. And the Forest Service is continuing to monitor these sites. The restoration started in 2018, and they're seeing a really gratifying response of a lot more salmonid spawning going on in this site. And in that context, I want to emphasize that many of us, maybe in Colombia, you might be a little more familiar with these multi-thread stable rivers like anastomoting channels, because I think you still have more. Certainly there are more on the Amazon side of South America, but these were really common globally. There have been some nice review papers showing how common they were historically in Europe. They were much more common in North America. We just had 200-300 years of beating them into submission, of basically channelizing them, damming them, making them single thread. But these systems naturally have limited longitudinal connectivity and very high lateral and vertical connectivity, and they tend to have very high biological productivity and biodiversity and provide a lot of ecosystem services. So if we can get people to be more accepting of the idea of multi-thread channels when they're thinking about river restoration, I think that would be really beneficial. So I just want to end by saying that we know that rivers around the world typically had very different levels of connectivity. Sometimes they were greater, sometimes they were less than we have today with our multiple human modifications of river corridors and networks. And our alterations of connectivity have caused a lot of loss of river ecosystem services. We can just take nitrate as an example. If you think about the eutrophication and hypoxia that characterize the nearshore and estuarine areas of most of the large rivers in industrialized countries in the middle latitudes. That's a great example. We've made the rivers more efficient at getting everything downstream and less efficient at retaining nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, and biologically processing them. So as recognition has grown of this, there's been this emphasis on trying to manage and restore rivers to restore natural levels of connectivity. And to the extent possible is key here. I'm not advocating we remake a multi-channel marsh in the middle of Bogota if there was one there historically, but we don't have to have just concrete canals. There are in-between points where you can have a small inset floodplain, for example, or a little more spatial heterogeneity and a little less longitudinal connectivity, even in urban areas. And in this context, I think it's a really nice opportunity for all of us who are river scientists, whether we're specialized in biology, chemistry, physical processes, to really focus on quantifying spatial and temporal characteristics of this three-dimensional connectivity in a variety of river networks around the world, and a variety of river reaches, from headwaters to big lowland rivers, from the tropics to the boreal zone. So we start to have more of an empirical database to work from in understanding connectivity. So I'll end with what I think of as a very nice example of high lateral connectivity. I had the opportunity to travel down the full length of the Amazon within the Amazon basin back in 2003 during flood stage, and it was really fascinating. And this is in the flooded forest on the floodplain. We were several kilometers from the main channel, but that water is about 8 meters deep there, and it will persist for months at a time because of the high lateral connectivity. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer questions.
This has been great. Dr. Wohl, Dr. Helen, thank you very much for your great presentation. At this moment, then, I'm going to start inviting people to write on or chat for any question that you want to send to Dr. Wohl. And then,
and would you like me to just read the questions directly from the chat?
They will be, yeah, there will be.
Probably the easiest.
They're writing in English right now. Yes, that's good. If you want to, the first one is from Gonzalo Padilla, he said, great presentation. Thank you. What's your opinion on using reference states for connectivity restoration?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. It's not always feasible um, because you may not have reference states in a highly altered region. You may find it very difficult. And just, I'm guessing everybody knows what a reference state is, but the idea is that you find the least human altered system and use that as a sort of a target for what the system you're interested in restoring might have looked like. So I think reference states are a good place to start if they exist. There's a couple of challenges with using them. One is that you need a lot of information because a natural river corridor or river network, of course, is not static. There's a natural range of variability, and you have to have some understanding of that. The second is that you may only be able to use the reference state as a, well, here's my ideal, but I can never get to that ideal because I'm in the middle of an urban area, for example. But it, at a minimum, it can tell you, I think, the potential of the system. So I do think reference states are very useful.
That sounds perfect. Thanks. La respuesta de la doctora Ellen a la pregunta hecha por Gonzalo. ¿Cuál es su opinión acerca de usar el estado de referencia para la actividad de restauración? La doctora Ellen responde que son unos buenos, es un buen punto de inicio para definitivamente avanzar un proceso de restauración. Sin embargo, tenemos que recordar que los ríos o los sistemas fluviales son sistemas dinámicos y que pues en algún momento obviamente el tomar referencias en ciertos estados se considera un componente estático y estamos perdiendo en algún momento esa dinámica y ese potencial cambio. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguien más quiere extender alguna pregunta a través del chat?
And I should just say, while we're waiting, I've had the opportunity to visit Bogota twice now, and in honor of doing this presentation today, I am drinking Colombian coffee.
Perfecto. That's excellent, and that's an honor for us. Thank you so much for sharing and for calling.
Oh, it is
Colombian coffee, the best.
My pleasure. It is. Well, you know,
Okay.
if you like, I can just read this first question myself.
Perfect, no problem.
What if we do not have access to a reference stage? What option we need to take as reference? Yeah, it's the best I can say is that if you don't actually have a reference condition for a particular type of catchment, you have to draw on all the lines of evidence that you can. And there are some nice papers that talk about things like natural range of variability of a system and how you can infer that. So you can use a combination of what's been published from around the world. You know, the organisms would be different in the equivalent latitude in Africa, for example, but some of the processes might be similar. You can try numerical modeling as a way of essentially manipulating the system and how you think you understand it and see what the outcomes are like. Or you can essentially say, my desired state is this, and define what your desired state is and think about how to get there. So as an example, let's say you have severe water quality degradation, and you think that's because of lack of microbial uptake of contaminants like excess nitrogen or phosphorus. Well, whatever the reference state might have been, maybe you're in the middle of Bogota now, so what are your options for limiting longitudinal connectivity and increasing hypereic exchange? Maybe having a small inset floodplain with native riparian vegetation would be a good way to get at that. So I think it's trying to think of the river corridor and the river network as holistically as you can, in the sense of thinking of them as a functional ecosystem and thinking about how you can promote the functions that are desired. I can just go to the next question. I think there are a large number of indices and ways to measure connectivity. So choosing one depends on the aspect of connectivity you want to measure, absolutely. There is no single connectivity metric that is comprehensive and applicable to all situations. Maybe we will have one in future, but for now, it's not exactly make it up as you go, but you can do a literature review and see if anyone has proposed something that would be applicable to your site. Otherwise, I think it would be you developing a conceptual model of the type of connectivity you're interested in. So maybe it's hydrology and its lateral connectivity, or maybe it's solids and its vertical connectivity, but whatever it is, thinking about the time and space scales that are most relevant, and then how you might characterize that connectivity. The one thing I would suggest to everyone, if you're not familiar with landscape ecology literature, they have spent, the landscape ecologists, particularly terrestrial ecologists, have spent a lot of time thinking about connectivity and spatial heterogeneity. So many of their metrics can be adapted to river corridors. That's one thing that I'm working on right now. I'll go to the next question. It's how can we evaluate longitudinal connectivity in a cascade system of many small hydro projects? Oh, but that's a tough one, because you're talking about cumulative effects. So you can look at the interruption of connectivity with each individual structure, but I think you would also want to go farther down the network and try and figure out what the cumulative effects are. I'm being a little vague because it really depends on what you're talking about. If you're interested in bed load, for example, that's easier to measure. You could look at the bed load that has accumulated upstream of each. I'm assuming these are dams and not, say, in-channel turbines. You could look at the sediment that has accumulated in each behind each small dam in the reservoir upstream, and look at the cumulative sediment decrease that would cause downstream. If you are looking at something else like a water chemistry parameter, it's going to be harder. So I guess a lot of to answer your question, it depends a lot, and I can't give you a straightforward answer. I think you'd have to define which parameters that are affected by longitudinal connectivity, like sediment or water or solids, and then think about what metrics you could use to look at the effect of each individual dam as well as the cumulative. The next question here is, what variable or aspect related to connectivity should not be missing in an index or a way to measure connectivity? Again, I think that depends a lot on the specific example, but I would start by saying for any kind of connectivity, those basic properties that I mentioned earlier, magnitude, duration, frequency, spatial extent, I would try to capture all of those. Realistically, the temporal features like frequency and duration are often harder to measure, especially over longer timescales, than the spatial characteristics. But if something like frequency and duration matters a lot, then thinking about what types of measurements you could employ to characterize those would be important. I'll give you an example. There was a paper that was published a few years ago in looking at ephemeral channels in Arizona, which is in the desert in the United States. And they put out sensors, and they basically, the sensors just recorded when there was or was not flow. So they could map over, I think it was a 2-year study, over the course of the 2 years, when certain portions of this length of this river had flowing surface water and when they didn't. And then they developed a metric of spatial and temporal aspects of connectivity based on that. And if you can't put out instruments to make direct measurements, or you want to try and deal with a longer time frame, maybe things like remote sensing, satellite-based imagery might help you with that. The next question is, how can we return a river corridor to the original connectivity or original condition when the connectivity has been totally lost, mainly due to erosion processes? So I'm assuming, or what I envision with this is something like a channel that has incised and it's now hydrologically disconnected from the floodplain. That was the example that I showed from the site in Oregon. The portion of the river downstream from a dam had incised and it was no longer hydrologically connected to a floodplain. Because they were in a national forest and it was government-owned land, in that case, they took pretty intensive restoration measures. They physically regraded the floodplain. So if you can see my hands, if the floodplain's up here and the channel's down here, they took heavy equipment and they moved them closer to one another. And they put a lot of obstacles into the flow in the form of large wood to recreate that connectivity. If you were in a much more constrained environment that had land use adjacent, then you wouldn't be able to do it to the same degree, but you could still take a similar approach. If you, after this, we're done chatting, if you get online and look up Big Spring Run, it's a restoration project in Pennsylvania, so in the northeastern US. It's an area that is agricultural and suburban, so there is a lot of land use, but they took a limited length of river, I think it's about a kilometer, and they did essentially the same thing. The channel had incised, it was disconnected from the floodplain, so they lowered the entire floodplain. This is not cheap, but they used heavy equipment to lower the floodplain, and they regraded the channel, and then they left it alone to adjust, and now they have a nice marsh wetland complex developing, which is what they were striving for. So I think the specifics of how you restore that connectivity depend on the constraints. Maybe you introduce obstacles to the channel to promote overbank flow, or maybe you lower the whole floodplain if that's feasible within the budget. The next question is it possible to have a balance between stream restoration and hydropower energy production in watersheds with large dams? What could be recommended to decision makers? Yeah, none of you are asking me easy questions. I guess what I'd say there is the emphasis in the United States, for example, which is the place I'm most familiar with, is trying to develop, for example, what are called high flow experimental releases. And the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon is the classic example. The dam is there, it's not going away. So instead of running it strictly for hydropower generation, they have more of a hybrid model. They're still generating hydropower, but they periodically release a larger amount of water, and they lose the income that would be associated with energy production there in order to have a flood that can help the ecosystem processes and properties downstream. So I guess what could be recommended to decision makers going forward, if the dam isn't built, then try to get them to think about turbines in the channel, and I've seen what are called micro hydro projects in Europe, where if there's space in the valley floor, they create an artificial secondary channel and they route some of the flow through that and spin the turbines that way. And the main channel is left unimpeded, so you still have sediment longitudinal connectivity and fish migration. If the dam is already there, then trying to encourage them to think about different operating regimes, including things like gravel bypassing and sediment augmentation downstream of the dam and fish passage. Although my impression is that it's really hard to get fish to go into whatever you build for them. They sense it as something unnatural. There's been limited success with that, but it's better than nothing. So I think that's all the questions for now. Those are really good questions. Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta adicional para la doctora Ellen a este punto? Dr. Ellen, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Many approaches are done regarding stream restoration. One of them, or one of the most commonly done, is based on natural restoration design. And very lately, using that approach itself, the restoration based on the hierarchical order of stream functionality. So that approach that involves evaluation for every one of the different functions of the stream, starting from hydrology toward biology, and based on that, the development of the stream quantification tool. What is your concept about this, the use of these tools, the stream quantification tools, and what will be the elements that we need to be careful when trying to build up every one of the elements associated to stream functionality into these tools that probably we are missing to really represent the entire system, or we could be even careful at the end when we kind of evaluate the pre and post conditions of the stream restoration project?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question. I think there are a couple of issues. One is that people develop tools like that because we're trying to have some kind of a standardized approach that is often used by restoration practitioners who may not be river scientists and may not have a lot of technical background. So I understand the need for that. The difficulties are, first of all, even if you are the most brilliant and knowledgeable river scientist in the world, you can never fully understand these really complex systems. So there's always uncertainty in the response trajectories, for example. You take some management action, and there's always some uncertainty into how the entire river ecosystem is going to respond. That is very difficult to communicate to people outside of the scientific community. There have been lots of studies that show that probability and uncertainty are difficult concepts to understand. So it's hard to communicate to stakeholders. That's one issue. The second issue is that often the response time for a management action is longer than we expect. Feedbacks and emergent system properties that may take a decade or 2 decades or 5 decades to show up. And our monitoring framework is usually much shorter than that. So we may undertake manipulations and not really have a very good understanding of what the longer term effects are going to be. I think the third thing is what you mentioned, John, that there are factors we may be missing that we just don't know about. We didn't even think of them. Having said all that, those are kind of negative things. I am very happy with these new approaches that include biology, for example. I think for too long, physical scientists have viewed riparian vegetation, for example, as just this passive respondent, and the water and sediment change and the vegetation responds. But the vegetation characteristics also strongly influence the distribution and the effects of water and sediment as one example. So I like the idea of sort of stream triangles that have those different components, and say in some systems biology really dominates, in others no, hydrology dominates or geology dominates. So with the caveat that one, we can't know everything, and we will always have uncertainty, and two, it's a really complex system. I like the trends, and I think something like the functional approach is a great improvement on what we've done in the past. It still has limitations. I think anything we try will always have some limitations, but I think we're improving.
I think I'm mute. Thank you so much, ma'am. Is there any other question that anybody in the audience wants to extend to Dr. Ellen Wohl after such a great presentation and comments? Okay, there are no more at this point. After Dr. Ellen, I think we don't. Okay, it looks like somebody has questions right now.
Okay.
Go ahead, Angelica.
She's probably typing.
Yeah, thank you for your comment and your point of view about what you commented on the stream quantification tool and these approaches. Some elements that definitely are kind of building up into different approaches, interests, and how to say kind of contradictions between professionals at some point with these kind of decisions. Okay, there is one question from Jose Antonio while Angelica types hers.
Yes, what method of environmental flow can we use to restore connectivity? Again, it would depend on the specific scenario, but the most common scenario is that we've reduced flood peak magnitude and duration. So a big one would be restoring peak flows. And I use the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River as an example. The high flow experimental releases they're doing are very small and of short duration compared to the natural snowmelt peak that was present prior to the dam, but it's better than nothing. So, within the constraints of, say, consumptive use or hydropower generation, any peak flows and any flow variability that can be restored are typically really important. Even if you don't have a floodplain, say, peak flows can laterally reconnect channels and floodplains. Even if you have something like a bedrock gorge, which is essentially what the Grand Canyon is, there are still functions that occur only at peak flow. In the case of the Grand Canyon, there are tributary alluvial fans that come in and constrict the main channel, and those are only modified at peak flows. So I think the most important method of environmental flow is typically to restore peak flows. And in floodplains, yeah, absolutely. Either restoring some aspect of the peak flows, like duration and magnitude, or if it's possible, regrading the floodplains to lower them. If they're so high now that no matter what you do in terms of peak flow, you'll never have overbank flow, than potentially lowering the floodplains. What techniques are used in spatial connectivity analysis? What sensors? Again, that varies a lot depending on the time and space scales. So the example that I mentioned from Arizona, they were using stream sensors in a single length of channel. I think it was about 10 or 20 kilometers long. If you were working with a larger river and you had access to satellite-borne imagery, you might be able to use that to look at the extent of flow or of turbidity in the flow. So I think what techniques are used depends on what kind of connectivity you're interested in and over what time and space scales. But they could be the basic measurements that I talked about earlier: ground-based, drones, remote-based, or modeling. Then I always found that we can do it, but for freshwater, usually for marine water. I think you mean spatial connectivity. Sorry, I'm not sure, Angelica, about that first one. The second one, are you accepting researchers for exchange, training and connectivity analysis, or internships? Yes, potentially. I think the major limitation for me is that I don't have funds to bring someone over, but if you have access to funding, as an example, I mentioned that I've been to Bogota a couple of times, or to Colombia. I have hosted PhD students from different Colombian universities, from Universidad de los Andes and from Medellin, to come over for 6 months or a year to work in my lab and interact with my grad students and the faculty here at CSU, and I'm happy to do that. I don't know what the world will be like for the next few months to a year as COVID messes us all up, but hypothetically, yes, I am accepting researchers, and I'd be happy to have visiting researchers. There's another question: why is it normally so difficult to include the holistic view of groundwater flow systems, superficial systems, ecosystems, interactions in the picture? Oh, that's a big one. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Why are we not holistic? Well, one, we're all trained in disciplines, so we have our disciplinary frameworks that we think in. Second, at least I'll speak again for the US example, we have legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks that promote disconnectivity. In the United States, all navigable waters are owned or are managed by the national government. Floodplains, forget it. That's private property. It's a completely different regulatory system. In my state of Colorado, it was only a decade ago that groundwater and surface water were legally recognized as being connected. Of course, everybody knew they were connected before that, but in the legal framework, no, they were completely different. So I would say it's a combination of for scientists, our disciplinary training. It's also not helped by the regulatory framework. And I think the general public has never heard of hyporeic systems. Maybe they've heard of groundwater. They don't think about what's going on, out of sight, out of mind. And I think they tend to regard floodplains as a nice place to build. And now it's terrible if it floods. They just don't view it as part of a river corridor. So changing attitudes through communication, I think, is really important.
Ok. ¿Alguna pregunta adicional para la doctora Ellen? Dr. Ellen Wohl, it's such a big honor for us. Thank you so much for being here. We are really humble, and we appreciate, once again, a question comes here. At this point, I'm not going to be able to finish saying goodbye. Thank you. Transboundary aquifers are probably the point of conflict. Okay, it's a comment that made Elizabeth after your
absolutely agree. Well, I would say thank you to everyone for the great questions. Those are really thought-provoking and thoughtful questions. So I appreciate that.
Thank you for our auditorium for being here. And from here, I'm pretty sure everyone is clapping at you and saying thank you very much for such an incredible, great, and as mentioned by Jose Antonio Arenas from Peru, say thank you for your inspiring presentation. It was really such a great and comprehensive and very interesting in the topics that you involve. Thanks a lot. We really appreciate always that you have been willing to work with us. Previous months ago with the work in the workshop of the eco-hydraulics and eco-hydrology, and now with our International Congress of River and Wetlands. So it's always a pleasure. At this point, we just say then we are hopeful that in the future we definitely will keep continuing having the opportunity to work with you and to interact with you for future alternatives. A todos los asistentes, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Muy respetuosamente quiero pedirles a todos, por favor, que salgan de la sesión, porque hasta que salga el último, el proceso de grabado de la sesión no termina. Entonces agradecemos, por favor, que todos salgan. Y de nuevo, muchísimas gracias por su presencia, una gran presentación, las extensiones de agradecimiento fueron dadas a la doctora Ellen y esperamos verlos a todos ustedes en la continuidad de nuestro programa a partir de permítame corriendo, voy a mirar el horario, a partir de las 12:50, tal vez de la 1 de la tarde. A partir de la 1 de la tarde tendremos entonces inicio a las sesiones especiales, así se tejen las culturas de los pueblos anfibios y rol de las empresas en la gestión sostenible de ríos y humedales. Perfecto. Los esperamos a ustedes en esta tarde. Un abrazo enorme, lo mejor para todos y gracias.